Within a period of 11 weeks in the year 1888, a series of brutal murders shocked London. You've heard the stories, you've seen the movies, but have you heard everything, uncensored, unembellished, the whole bloody tale? Today we'll do just that, providing details of the crimes you've never heard before. We're going to disclose some frankly disturbing things about day-to-day life in London's Victorian slums, and finish with our thoughts on who Jack the Ripper was. In the words of writer Philip K. Dick, all things are effed up. But after researching this show, we're going to say you couldn't get much more effed up than the streets of Whitechapel in the late 1800s. That's where we'll start, the streets. The incredibly mean streets. The British Empire in the late 19th century was going full steam ahead, having already expanded millions of square miles around the globe. Britain was an incredibly wealthy superpower. It was the global policeman. The sun didn't set on its empire, yet the money didn't always trickle down to the people often referred to as the irresponsible lower classes. Our story's mostly about those people. It takes place in Whitechapel, an area of East London renowned in Victorian times, 1831 to 1901, for its poverty-stricken streets, a collection of dingy and dangerous places off the main Whitechapel High Street. This Whitechapel slum, aka a rookery, was sometimes referred to as the Abyss. One writer explained that this is where the thief and the prostitute are harbored, among those whose only crime is poverty. The slums smelled awful. The writer George Gissing explained, an evil smell hung about the butchers and fish shops. A public house poisoned a whole street with alcoholic fumes. From sewer grates rose a miasma that caught the breath. Rats scurried around underfoot. Disease was rife. Cholera outbreaks were common. Tuberculosis thrived in the conditions where entire families were cramped in highly unsanitary one-room abodes. The lodging houses you'll hear about in detail today. Venereal disease flourished. There were outbreaks of smallpox and typhoid. People choked in the London fog, a thick pall of smoke from coal burning. Muggings and attacks on women were common, and the perpetrators, having the cover of smog, could often disappear into the dimly lit streets. In 1885, there were 13,319 police officers in London's Metropolitan Police for over 5 million Londoners. This included the variety of immigrants who made the city their home. Jews from Europe, Irish, Russian, German, French, Italian. The Met was split into 20 divisions. In 1878, Scotland Yard introduced the Criminal Investigation Department, or CID, plainclothes cops who at first investigated corrupt police, but then were tasked with investigating serious public crimes. In 1886, Charles Warren became the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, a man, as you'll see, who came undone at the hands of the Ripper. H Division of the Metropolitan Police was responsible for Whitechapel. On top of a superintendent and a chief inspector, there were 27 inspectors, 37 sergeants, and close to 500 constables, as well as 15 CID men. They policed about 176,000 people, with about one cop per every 300 people in the Whitechapel area. It's fair to say that they had their work cut out for them. The American author Jack London explained that it was hard to escape the sight of abject poverty. He said the streets thronged with people of wretched or beer-sodden appearance, where he witnessed long vistas of bricks and misery, and the air was obscene with the sounds of jangling and squabbling. Within all this squalor, there was a constant fear of violence, which was amplified by the rise of sensational news media and fictionalized in the popular penny dreadfuls, pulp publications describing murder and mayhem. In 1888, even the penny dreadfuls would look tame at the sight of Jack the Ripper's bloody depravity. Everything was about to change. In February of that year, 38-year-old Annie Millwood of Spitalfields was savagely attacked by a man wielding a clasp knife. An article in the Eastern Post explained, "It appears the deceased was admitted to the Whitechapel Infirmary, suffering from numerous stabs in the legs and lower part of the body. She made a full recovery and was sent to the South Grove Workhouse, but died in March from what coroner Winnie Edwin Baxter said was a sudden effusion into the pericardium from the rupture of the left pulmonary artery through ulceration. Her dying young was nothing out of the ordinary." Life expectancy for the whole of London during this period was about 37. The wealthy lived, on average, much longer than the poor. The life expectancy for an East End laborer was just 19. If we look at the age of deaths according to Whitechapel Registration District 1891, the highest death figures are of infants. The vast majority of people in Whitechapel died from the age of 15 to 35. Women lived longer than men, but not much more. Males tended to die more than women at laboring age 14 to 34. Annie Millwood had been a prostitute, as many poor women were in their continual efforts to obtain temporary lodgings for the night. That same March, the 29-year-old machinist Ada Wilson was attacked in her home. Ada was a dressmaker. But as her neighbors would later say, she had many male visitors come to her house in the dark hours. On the night of the 28th, a man arrived in her room on 9 Maidman Street, Mile End. She answered the door. A mustached man, about age 30, wearing a dark coat, demanded money. When she refused, he used a clasp knife to stab her in the throat. These stories might or might not directly relate to the murders of Jack the Ripper, but to understand him, we must understand where he preyed. We must also understand that serial killers often build up to their most gruesome acts, escalating their levels of violence. Less than a week after the attack on Annie, Emma Elizabeth Smith of Spitalfields was getting ready for work at her lodging house, applying her makeup and combing her hair. She was 45 and already a widow, not too attractive, known as one of the unfortunates. She was a prostitute who worked in the darkest corners of the darkest alleys for the lowest prices. The owner of her lodging house said that Emma would often come home with black eyes that men had given her. On one occasion, she returned home traumatized, explaining she had been thrown out of a window. The night of what would be a much more savage attack, she was seen with a man wearing dark clothing and a white neckerchief. The woman who saw her, fellow prostitute Margaret Hayes, said she had been punched in the mouth that night and so had decided to quit work early. Later, she met Emma, who said she had just been viciously attacked and robbed at what the papers called the dirty, narrow entrance to Brick Lane. Emma was in pain, serious pain, so Margaret took her to London Hospital, where Emma was seen by the house surgeon, Dr. George Haslip, a man who was used to seeing drunken prostitutes. But he was shocked at her injuries, which included a torn ear and damage to her peritoneum and other internal organs. She'd been savaged, outraged as the term was back then. She died 2 days later from peritonitis, the infection following a rupture of the abdomen. In the report written by Inspector Edmund Reed, he wrote, "She was in the habit of leaving about 6 or 7 p.m. and returning at all hours, usually drunk. She was aged 45 years, 5 foot 2 inches high, complexion fair, hair light brown, scar on right temple, no description of men." Emma had told Margaret that she thought she was attacked by 3 men, one as young as 19. Was this the work of one of the many gangs that roamed London at night, or was it part of a murderous conspiracy including the Ripper? Emma's death did not go unnoticed. The crime was shocking even for London's East End. Newspaper headlines included, "Horrible murder in Whitechapel." On Saturday, the 14th of April, the Worcestershire Chronicle wrote, "Robbed, outraged, and wounded unto death, under circumstances of exceptional brutality, by a gang of ruffians while she was staggering home, the worse for drink." Describing Whitechapel for outsiders, the article said, "It seems scarcely possible to believe that a woman could fall to such depths of degradation, and yet she is no more than a typical example of those who patronize the foul haunts of these fearful houses, where drinking, fighting, and all other loathsome vices are the pastime of poor wretches who can't raise 2 shillings a week for the accommodation they get within their fetid walls." The coroner said it was impossible to imagine a more brutal and dastardly assault, but little did he know, worse was soon to come. Far, far worse. After the boozy bank holiday of August 6th, Martha Tabram was found dead in George Yard, off Whitechapel High Street at 4:45 a.m., now the 7th. Martha, abandoned by her father when she was a teenager, later had 2 children of her own, but the devil drink got its claws into her, and she was left by her husband. After finding out she was a prostitute, he reduced the 12 shillings maintenance allowance he paid her each week. Close to the time of her murder, she was living in lodging houses with William Turner. They tried to make ends meet by hawking trinkets in the streets, but it was never enough. As was common with poor couples, not just single women, she sold her body at night. William eventually left her, stating her alcoholism made their lives impossible. He explained, "Since she had been living with me, her character for sobriety was not good. If I gave her any money, she generally spent it on drink. In fact, it was always drink. Drink, hooch, sauce, firewater, whatever you like to call it, plays a major role in the story today, so we should just say a few things about it." After London's so-called gin craze in the mid-18th century, the British government tried to implement laws, the Gin Acts of 1736 and 1751, to cut down on alcohol abuse. In the 1730s, the average consumption of gin in London was 2 pints a week. That was the average. Some people did not drink any alcohol, so you can imagine how much those people who did drink consumed on a weekly basis. The government had some success, but in the 19th century, booze addiction became rife once more. It was at the center of much of the crime. As the Worcester Journal on Saturday the 14th of November 1891 explained, "There is no mistake about what is the cause of nearly all the crime on the East End of London. The curse of all is drink, and I must say that the wives are often worse than the husbands." Coroner Baxter, whom we mentioned earlier, told the Edinburgh Evening News on Thursday the 22nd of September 1892, Generally speaking, the question of drunkenness, directly or indirectly, enters into half of the inquests which I hold. When poor folks can't afford gin, some resorted to drinking methylated spirits. A lot were women whose lives comprised a long list of traumas they wanted to escape. Another report stated, "At any of the public houses in my district, go where you will, you'll find more women than men, and these in many cases are young women, some not over the age of 22. People drank at all hours." But what about kids? Who took care of the kids? Many poor kids roamed the streets, since after the 1833 Factory Act, children under 9 weren't supposed to work at all, and children 9 to 13 could work no more than 9 hours a day. From 13 to 18, they could work no more than 12 hours a day. But this meant more mothers looking after kids who'd formerly been in the mines and factories, and that meant more time to drink. This was criticized much more than it was analyzed. Another report said, "Visiting along a lane in my district recently at 11 o'clock in the morning, I met drunken women in 3 houses consecutively, all being mothers with large families. Unfortunately, many of the witnesses you'll hear about in this show were blind drunk at the time of the crime." London was sodden with cheap hooch, creating a long line of very unreliable witnesses to serious crimes. Back to Martha. When she died, William was staying at the Workingmen's Home on Commercial Street, and Martha at a common lodging house on George Street, Spitalfields. The last time he saw her alive was on August 4th, when he met her at the junction of Leadenhall Street and Aldgate High Street. She told him she was out of cash, so he gave her 1 shilling and 6 pence. Records show that wages for a 10-hour and 6-day week in London in the late 1800s was 3 shillings and 9 pence per week for common laborers. For bricklayers, smiths, masons, and carpenters, the wage was 6 shillings and 6 pence per week, 12 pence was 1 shilling, and 240 pence was a pound. Women upholsterers might get 9 shillings a week, and a male workshop apprentice 8 to 10 shillings a week. Those people who walked around wearing sandwich boards advertising various goods were paid 1 shilling to 1 shilling 8 pence per day in 1894. The cost of a single room per week for a lower-paid person might have ranged from 3 to 6 shillings, but the temporary lodgings, aka the Doss House or Flop House, places you'll hear about throughout today's show, were much cheaper. Some beds were just 6 pence or even 4 pence a night, but unlike the workhouse, there wasn't any back-breaking labor involved. 4 pence in today's money is about $2. The cheapest form of a night's sleep was 2 pence. For that, people were offered a rope to hang over all night. This was sometimes called the 2-penny hangover or the lean-to. Many of the people you'd find there were just children, beggars, pickpockets, or as people called them, little scoundrels. Compared to the cold street, the rope was a luxury. At around 5 in the morning, the rope was cut, whether or not its hangers were awake or asleep. There were also the penny sit-ups, a room perhaps heated, but where sleeping wasn't allowed. Monitors would walk around waking people up. Better were the Salvation Army's 4 or 5 penny coffins, wooden boxes where people could sleep for the night, and were offered a blanket, a cup of tea, and a slice of bread. The writer George Orwell later remarked, "It is cold, and the worst thing about it is the bugs, which being enclosed in a box you cannot escape." William was staying at a workhouse where the working conditions were brutal, and the diet consisted of a lot of porridge. And Martha was at a lodging house where she was packed in with other women for her 6 pence a night. One person usually got 8 hours of the bed, after which another woman would take it. Lodging house beds were allocated through a kind of timeshare, where prostitutes could disappear for 16 hours and come home to an empty bed. In Whitechapel at the time of Jack the Ripper, there were 233 common lodging houses home to around 8,000 people, many of them thieves, drunkards, and prostitutes who'd often defecated into pots, making the places stink and rendering the inhabitants vulnerable to disease and diarrhea. There were close to 1,200 prostitutes in Whitechapel in 1888, most of whom worked on the streets, but also in the 62 brothels. This was an area of 357 acres that someone could cover on foot in 20-odd minutes. So there were a lot of prostitutes. Gangs ran these streets, demanding protection money from the shopkeepers and extorting the prostitutes. Fallen women were seen as fair game. The entire area was chaotic. Not even the police would dare go down some streets. When William gave Martha the money, the weather had been bitterly cold and raining. Martha was desperate for a room for the night. Even so, she began her evening having drinks with Mary Ann Connolly, aka Pearly Paul. At 11 p.m., Martha's sister-in-law, Ann Morris, saw her in White Swan Pub on Whitechapel High Street. Martha was with Mary, the two being bought drinks by 2 soldiers, a corporal and a private. All 4 left the pub together but split up at George Yard. It was time for sex, the infamous Whitechapel back alley bonk. Mary took her soldier to Angel Alley, a filthy place home to poor Irish migrants known for fighting and chasing rent collectors away, often used as a shortcut to Brick Lane. The East London Advertiser called it one of the most dangerous streets in the locality. Martha and her man chose the next alley at George Yard. At around 2 a.m., Police Constable Thomas Barrett was patrolling past the alleys when he noticed a soldier and remarked that he was a long way from his barracks. For the soldier to tell him that he was waiting for his friend, who'd gone off with a woman. At 3:30 a.m., 21-year-old Alfred George Crow, a driver, got back to his house in George Yard buildings. He thought he saw something on the ground on the first floor but ignored it. Drunks and the homeless often lay around the building. But when at around 4:45 a.m. the casual laborer John Saunders Reeves saw something on the floor, there was already enough light to see that it was a woman. He saw blood and immediately ran to find a policeman. He soon returned to the scene of the crime with Constable Barrett, who subsequently fetched Dr. Timothy Killeen. Killeen later wrote that the deceased had been victim of a frenzied attack, with the perpetrator stabbing the woman 39 times. He'd even changed knives, stabbing her with a regular pocket knife, but also what he said was possibly a sword bayonet or dagger. At first, police did not know the identity of the victim, so they released a description to the newspapers. The body, which was that of a woman apparently between 35 and 40 years of age, about 5 foot 3 inches in height, complexion and hair dark, wore a dark green skirt, a brown petticoat, a long black jacket, and a black bonnet. The East London Observer described the crime as one of the most terrible cases that anyone can possibly imagine. The man must have been a perfect savage to have attacked the woman in that way. Inspector Edmund Reed tried to ascertain who the soldier was that Constable Barrett had seen. Reed interviewed suspects at a local barracks but identified no one. On August 9th, Mary came forward and identified the body. The East London Observer wrote the next day, Inspector Reed, accompanied by Pearlie Paul, proceeded to the tower on Monday afternoon, where she was confronted with every non-commissioned officer and private who was on leave of absence at the time of the outrage. She failed to pick any man out whom she and Martha had been with that night. She might have been drunk, but she told Reed she remembered the men had white bands around their caps, meaning they were likely from the Coldstream Guards. She later picked 2 men out, but it turned out that it couldn't have been them. Both had alibis. Mary was not a reliable witness. The South Wales Echo reported on Monday, August 20th, Pearlie Paul is a dangerous person to trust. She bamboozled the police into the idea that she could give them a clue to the Whitechapel murder. The mysterious soldiers were never found. The East London Advertiser commented that there was a feeling of insecurity when a woman could be so brutally murdered as people slept close by, and a killer could disappear without a trace or clue being left. These crimes became known as the Whitechapel murders, but by no means it's assured that Jack the Ripper was the perpetrator of them all. Some ripperologists have even said he might have committed 13 murders in all. There were investigators at the time of the killings who said the Ripper only killed 4 or 5 or 6, but for the most part people agree on 5. These 5 have what the cops call a similar signature and modus operandi. They are the canonical 5. On the night of August 30th, 31st, the weather report for London stated that on this night, the second day of the moon's last quarter, it would be partly cloudy but fine. It wasn't fine for a woman named Mary Ann Nichols. It was the worst night of her life. Born Mary Ann Walker on August 26, 1845, not far from the famed Fleet Street in London, Mary was the daughter of Edward Walker, a locksmith, and his wife Caroline. In 1864, Mary, then just 18, got hitched to a printer's machinist named William Nichols. Life was good. At least it was for a while, until young William had an affair with the midwife who helped deliver their 4th kid. The relationship had been failing for quite some time anyway, with William saying he'd had enough of his wife's compulsive boozing. The two split up in 1880, with the kids staying with William, barring one of the boys who went to live with his grandfather. Now Mary was in trouble, barely able to survive on the 5 shillings a week that William gave her as an allowance. In 1882, when he found out his former beloved was working as a prostitute, he stopped the payments completely. Mary went to live with her dad, but her constant drunkenness didn't work out for him either, so she ended up in a workhouse. The doss houses were cheap, but way better than the workhouse. The workhouse for poor Victorians was seen as the end of the line. Mary later managed to land a job as a domestic servant for Samuel and Sarah Cowdrey, but after 2 months she stole £3 10 shillings from them and hit the road, ending up in a lodging house on 18 Thrall Street, sharing a room with a woman named Emily Holland, as well as 4 other women. On the fateful night, Mary was 43 years old. She might have just been 5 feet 2, but she looked like she knew how to scrap, with a scar on her forehead and missing her front teeth. They'd been knocked out in a street fight. That night, August 30th, she was spotted walking down Whitechapel Road. Like many nights for Mary, this one was grim. She'd earlier been kicked out of her lodging since she didn't have the 4 pence for the bed. Still, she was adamant she'd get her DOS money soon, telling the lodging house deputy as if she didn't care about the room, "See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." At about 12:30, now August 31st, she was seen coming out of the Frying Pan pub. The night wasn't fine, as the weather forecast had predicted. It was now raining. At 2:30 a.m., Mary was seen by Emily Holland on the corner of Osborne Street and Brick Lane. Emily told Mary she'd just been at Shadwell Dry Dock watching the fire. In those days, there were often fires in London, which at times were like spectator sports. Emily later said Mary was steaming drunk. Emily tried to persuade her to go with her back to Thrall Street. It seems Mary had indeed gotten her DOS money, telling Emily, "I've had my lodging money 3 times today and I've spent it." She promised Emily that she'd be back at the lodgings another time. At 3:15 a.m., Constable John Thane walked past Bucks Row while on his regular beat. PC John Neal was also around Bucks Row at that time, as was Sergeant Kirby. None of them saw anything suspicious, but at 3:40, a carman, like a delivery driver, named Charles A. Cross noticed something on the ground close to the gates that led up to New Cottage. He thought at first it was just a tarpaulin, a sheet, but when he crossed the road, he noticed it was the body of a woman on the path with her hands by her sides. Lying at her side was a black straw bonnet trimmed with black velvet. Her eyes were open, her skirts were raised almost to her stomach. Robert Paul, another carman, soon joined Cross, both men now in shock at what lay before them. After feeling her cold hand, Cross said the woman was dead. Although Paul felt her cheek, and since it was still warm, he said she was likely alive. They both went in search of a policeman, later finding PC Misen at the corner of Hanbury Street and Baker's Row. At 3:44 a.m., Constable Neal came across the body. She was dead, there was no doubt about that. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear, although she was indeed quite warm, leading Neal to believe she'd only recently died. The killer was no doubt nearby. Misen was soon on the scene, as was PC Thane, who later said he arrived at 3:47. It was Thane who went off to find Dr. Reese Ralph Llewellyn at 152 Whitechapel Road, knocking at the doctor's door and waking him up. Meanwhile, Neal went to try to find a stretcher to get more help, this time from Bethnal Green Police Station. By this time, the slaughtermen, James Mumford and Henry Tompkins, were on the scene. They stood back as Dr. Llewellyn examined the body, noting the severe cuts to the throat and also noting that the woman's legs were warm. As Sergeant Kirby joined what was now a small crowd, on Dr. Llewellyn's orders, the body was taken to the mortuary shed at Old Montague Street Workhouse Infirmary. PC Thane awaited Inspector John Spratling of H Division at the scene of the crime, just as the son of a Mrs. Green cleaned up the blood in the street. The lack of blood would lead to various theories. Some believed the woman had been killed elsewhere and dumped there. But Inspector Aberline, whom you'll meet again in this show, was sure the woman had been killed there on Bucks Row. At about 5 a.m., PC Neal and Inspector Spratling went to the mortuary for an update on the body. They were taken aback when informed by Dr. Llewellyn the victim's abdomen had been violently slashed open, exposing her intestines. At 6:30 a.m., 2 men from the Whitechapel Workhouse were given the unenvious task of washing the victim's body, despite entreaties from Detective Sergeant Enright that she shouldn't be cleaned yet. On September 1st at 10 a.m., Dr. Llewellyn began his full post-mortem examination of the body. He first noticed a bruise on the woman's face, believing that the killer had likely held her head as he sliced through her throat, which were actually 2 cuts, both penetrating the spine, some 4 inches and 8 inches in length. There was a deep, jagged cut on her abdomen that reached all the way to her breastbone, as well as a series of smaller cuts and 3 or 4 similar cuts down her right side. The doctor assumed the cutting instrument was a large knife of average sharpness. He believed all these cuts would have taken 4 or 5 minutes, stating that the killer may have had some rough knowledge of human anatomy, though no organs had been removed from the body. It seemed the killer was left-handed and had attacked the victim from the front, although the doctor later said the killer may have been right-handed and attacked her from behind. Later that same day at the Whitechapel Lads Institute, Coroner Baxter held an inquest in front of a crowd of excited journalists and citizens. 3 witnesses spoke on the first day and 8 on the second. By this time, Mary had already been identified by her friend Emily and by another woman, Mary Monk, from the Lambeth Workhouse. Mary's clothes showed a laundry mark of that workhouse. On seeing the body, ex-husband William cried out, "Seeing you as you are now, I forgive you for what you have done to me." Inspector Aberline, the former head of Whitechapel CID, returned from Scotland Yard to work on the case. The investigation was at first headed by Robert Anderson, but due to sickness he was replaced by Detective Chief Inspector Donald Sutherland. They believed gangs were likely the culprits, but still interviewed the two slaughterhouse workers. Both had alibis. The cops were unsure, but that didn't stop the press from writing sensational stories. They talked of a man referred to as Leather Apron, who apparently had stalked, threatened, and robbed a number of local prostitutes. The East London Observer's description was tantalizing for its readers, stating about this man, his face was not altogether pleasant to look upon by reason of the grisly black strips of hair, nearly an inch in length, which almost covered his face. The thin lips too had a cruel, sardonic kind of look, which was increased if anything by the drooping dark mustache and side whiskers. The press explained that this scary man was the Hebrew type, a Jew. It's important to state here that with so many Jews coming to London from Europe, there was rampant anti-Semitism. Only 8 days into the investigation, with public anger boiling up over the mysterious Jew in his leather apron, another body was found. The panic went up a notch. The victim was Annie Chapman. Annie, known to her friends as Dark Annie, was born in the Paddington area of London in 1841. She married John Chapman, a coachman, when she was 27, and together they had 3 children. Annie's life did not turn out to be a bed of roses. In 1882, she lost a 12-year-old daughter to meningitis. Her crippled son John was placed in care. Her other daughter left the family to go to France, leaving Annie daughterless. She split up with John and for a time survived on the 10 shillings a week allowance he sent to her. Then he died in 1886. He too was a heavy drinker, dying from liver cirrhosis. Annie went to live with Jack Sivey, a sieve maker, but her drinking got the better of her and he left. Annie's brother Fontaine later told the press that his sister had first took a drink when she was quite young, and despite warnings from him and her sisters, she always went back to the rum, her poison of choice. It was then that she followed a trajectory of so many women in London, ending up at a lodging house at 35 Dorset Street, Spitalfields. To make ends meet, she often sold flowers and did crochet work, but when money was scarce, she turned to prostitution. At times, a 47-year-old bricklayer's laborer named Edward the Pensioner Stanley paid for her bed. Annie felt like she'd lost everything. It was at this point that her friend said she became severely depressed, often talking about how she wanted to die. A week before her death, Annie had been banged up in a fight with Eliza Cooper, who'd accused her of stealing a bar of soap at the lodging house. Another story says Annie noticed Eliza stealing from a man named Harry, and they fought over that. A few days later, she was taken ill, treated not for the black eye she sustained in the fight, but for a general feeling of malaise. On the date of her death, September 7th, this 47-year-old woman looked a state. Standing at 5 feet, rather plump with dark brown hair and blue eyes, she had a thick nose and fair skin. She still had bruising on her face and had lost 2 front teeth in a fight. Her autopsy revealed the rest of her teeth were okay, explaining the front teeth were perfect as far as the first molar, top and bottom, and very fine. At 5 p.m. that evening, her friend Amelia Palmer saw her on Dorset Street. Annie was sober, but feeling ill. Amelia asked if she was going to Stratford, likely where Annie would pick up men. Annie told her, "I must pull myself together and go out and get some money or I shall have no lodgings." At 11:30, she headed to Crossingham Lodging House and asked for permission to go to the kitchen, where at around midnight, she's seen by William Stevens. After producing a box, she tells him she's been to the hospital. On opening the box, she pulls out 2 pills. The 2 have a beer. Annie, Stevens will later say, was already drunk by then. Seems she'd gotten 5 pence from her sister in Vauxhall, but instead of using it for a place to bed down for the night, she spent it on drinks. Beer ads from the 1880s tell us you could get a pint for 2 pence. Gin, aka Mother's Ruin, was very cheap if a person couldn't afford beer. At 1:35 a.m., John Evans, the night watchman at the lodging house, asks Annie for the 4 pence for the bed for the night. She tells him she has no money, then explains to Timothy Donovan, the deputy, that if he'd be so kind as to hold the bed, she'll go out to get the 4 pence and soon pay him. So Annie needs to make 4 pence fast. But she was 47, not so pretty and bashed up from fighting. She was ill. So you might wonder then, how much could she make on the streets as a prostitute? This is something we should explain to help you better understand the lives of the Victorian poor. It's hard to say exactly how much sex with a Whitechapel prostitute would cost in those days, since a lot would depend on her age, how desperate she was, or maybe he was, and what exactly the act involved. It's generally thought that a quickie down a dark alley with a low-cost sex worker was about 4 pence. That was the absolute bargain basement of sex work. It meant a roof over your head for one night. The best work was when highly attractive women were in the service of aristocrats or even politicians. These women might have been referred to as courtesans, but payment for sex was the name of the game. Some married those rich men as a way to achieve safety in a world where they had few opportunities. One former courtesan wrote in her memoirs, "I shall not say why and how I became at the age of 15 the mistress of the Earl of Craven. It was very common back then for rich men to buy the bodies of women, or shall we say girls." According to W.T. Steed, an investigative journalist who famously died on the Titanic, a rich man could have a medical examiner check a girl's virginity status. If she was indeed a virgin, her services could be bought for 5 whole pounds. She could only sell this service once, of course, something rich men happily paid for given the pervasiveness of venereal disease in those days. You'll remember that 1 pound was 240 pence, so 5 pounds was 1,200 pence. You could rent a 3-room place in Soho, then quite a rundown area, for 14 to 20 shillings a week, 168 pence to 240 pence. Ergo, 5 pounds was a lot. Prostitution was one way an uneducated poor woman could earn a decent living, although decent was not a word usually used to describe that living. Steed's journalism shocked the entire country, which led to the government introducing the age of consent laws under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. In a memoir published in 1888, a man explains that he paid as much as 5 shillings for intercourse and 1 shilling for what he described as a feel. As is true today, the cost between high-end and low-end was vast, but at 47, ailing, not too pretty, with missing teeth and a bruised face, Annie would very likely have inhabited the bottom rung of the ladder for prostitution for the so-called fallen women. Her services, we imagine, were cheap. The last words Timothy Donovan said to her were, "You can find money for your beer, and you can't find money for your bed." Annie then walked out into the street and heads to Brushfield Street and on towards Spatial Fields Market. At 3:30 a.m., a carman named Thompson leaves for work. His room is at 29 Hanbury Street, which is home to 17 people living in 8 rooms. It's cramped there, but better than Crossingham, which is just a few yards down the street. At 4:45 a.m., a man named John Richardson, the son of one of the occupants of 29 Hanbury Street, stops in the yard of a house, a small area measuring 14 square feet. He bends down to cut some leather from his boot with a knife as his toes are hurting. He sits there for about 2 minutes and sees nothing suspicious. At some point between 5:20 and 5:30, a carpenter named Albert Kadosh, who lives in a room at 27 Hanbury Street, walks outside and thinks he hears people talking. At 29, he can't see much since the houses are divided by a 5-foot fence. He thinks he hears a woman say no. He then thinks he hears a scuffle and someone falling against the fence, but then everything goes quiet. On his way to Spitalfields, he sees nothing suspicious. At 5:30, Elizabeth Long walks down Hanbury Street on her way to Spitalfields Market, and she sees a man and a woman talking outside House 29. The woman she will identify later as Annie Chapman. The man she can't see well since he's standing with his back toward her, but she can make out that he's about 40 and taller than Annie. She can see he has a dark complexion and what she will call a shabby, genteel appearance, wearing a brown deerstalker hat and a dark coat. Long will say she is sure this guy is foreign. She'll hear the man say, "Will you?" and Annie say yes. She was sure it was 5:30 exactly since she heard the clock at the Black Eagle Brewery on Brick Lane strike for half an hour. At 5:45, carman John Davis wakes up. Davis goes downstairs and into the yard, whereupon he sees the body of a woman lying parallel to the fence. Her head is about 6 inches from the bottom step, her feet pointing toward the shed, her left arm lying across her chest. Her throat has been cut, her skirts are up to her waist, her face is completely covered in blood. In shock, Davis runs out into the street, where he shouts in the direction of a man named Henry Holland. 2 other men, James Green and James Kent, both about to go to work at a packing case manufacturer, are standing at house number 23. All the men see the body and head off in different directions. Green goes to work, Kent goes looking for a policeman but gives up and elects instead to go for a glass of brandy to steady his nerves. He soon returns with a sheet to place over what he can see as a very cut-up woman. It's Davis who first gets to the cops when he arrives at 6 a.m. at the Commercial Street Police Station. Still panting from the run, he explains to Inspector John Chandler the gruesome discovery. By the time Chandler gets to the body with a couple of his men, there's already a crowd. He soon sends for Dr. George Bagster Phillips, a police surgeon, and ensures somebody gets the news to Scotland Yard. When Phillips arrives, he notes the victim's left arm is lying across her breast. Her knees are bent outward. He writes, "The face is swollen and turned on the right side. The tongue protrudes between the front teeth but not beyond the lips. The tongue is evidently much swollen." The body is already showing signs of rigor mortis. Her neck has been sliced with jagged incisions. Blood from her neck has pooled on the floor, and some has spattered into the fence. The doctor believes she died in this spot since there's no signs of blood elsewhere in the yard. He thinks she's been dead about 2 hours. Chandler and Phillips tell the crowd to get back, both of them searching for clues around the yard. They come across a woman's belongings, a pocket comb, a small tooth comb, and a small envelope containing 2 pills. On the right side of the envelope, the letter M is written. On the other, there's a seal for the Sussex Regiment. 2, maybe 3 brass rings are missing from her fingers. A leather apron is found close by, but it'll turn out to be the property of a local man. Detective Sergeant Thick arrives, as does Sergeant Leake and later Inspector Aberline. Everyone thinks the same thing. This looks like the work of the person who killed Marianne Nichols. They have a madman on their hands. On September 8th, Dr. Phillips, after showing his annoyance at 2 nurses for washing the body without his permission, begins his post-mortem examination. A report of his findings issued sometimes later reads, "There was a bruise over the right temple, on the upper eyelid there was a bruise, and there were 2 distinct bruises, each the size of a man's thumb, on the forepart of the top of the chest. The stiffness of the limbs was now well marked. There was a bruise over the middle part of the bone of the right hand. The cut through the throat is severe. He notices her lungs are diseased, and so too is her brain. This woman had a little time to live, he believes. There wasn't much food in her stomach. She was malnourished. He believed the killer had held her chin while cutting her throat, which was sliced from left to right." The report stated, "The abdomen had been entirely laid open. The intestines, severed from their mesenteric attachments, had been lifted out of the body and placed on the shoulder of the corpse, whilst from the pelvis the uterus and its appendages, with the upper portion of the vagina and the posterior 2/3 of the bladder, had been entirely removed. This had been done in a way to avoid damaging the other organs." The report said, "Obviously the work was that of an expert, of one at least who had such knowledge of anatomical or pathological examinations as to be able to secure the pelvic organs with one sweep of the knife. Even the way the neck was cut," said the report, "seemed to indicate great anatomical knowledge. If the doctor himself had done such an operation, it would have taken the best part of an hour, and a considerable amount of skill and anatomical knowledge. The weapon," he said, "would not have been an ordinary knife, but either a surgeon's amputating knife or a slaughterman's knife." He did say that he thought she'd been strangled first before he cut her throat, and went to work on her internal organs. On September 10th, when Baxter led the inquest, he didn't include all these details out of fear of upsetting those in attendance. It was believed that Annie had been killed about 4:20, but this didn't gel with witness statements that had been heard. The people that would have seen her body, especially John Richardson, who when he bent down to fix his shoes, surely would have noticed a dead woman sliced and diced on the ground. Baxter concluded that Richardson just didn't go down the steps, so he missed her. As for the others who heard her, Baxter said they must have been mistaken about the time. On September 26, Baxter announced that whoever had committed this heinous crime must have had some anatomical knowledge, more than an animal slaughterer would have. The precision of the organ removal was just too good for a layman. It was Baxter's early contention that the murder had something to do with an American man who it was rumored had been in London looking to buy human organs. Still, he seemed to drop this line of inquiry in later inquests. On September 15th, the Daily Telegraph reported, "The funeral of Annie Chapman took place early yesterday morning, the utmost secrecy having been observed, and none but the undertaker, police, and relatives of the deceased knew anything about the arrangements. The public all asked one thing: how does a man who obviously was covered in blood, carrying a knife as well as human organs, just glide through the city full of people on their way to their early morning jobs?" London was aflame with conspiracy theories. People gathered around Hanbury Street to see where it happened, so many of them that the people turned up with their hand carts to sell fruits and vegetables. Hawkers scurried around, pickpockets came, women in bonnets offered men a good time. The British Home Office refrained from offering a reward out of fear it would cause people to lie and confuse the police. The press again talked about leather apron. Some people screamed, "Foreigners," blaming the Jewish population. Jews were verbally assaulted on their way to work. Police did everything to stop a riot from happening. You could cut the tension with a dagger. There were a few suspects. German hairdresser Charles Ludwig, who police dragged in for questioning, as they did William Piggott, a drunk who'd been heard threatening to hurt women in the Pope's Head pub in Gravesend, Kent. It turns out Piggott, like many poor Londoners, was mentally unwell, once likely a resident of the asylum. Records show he had a history of alcoholic withdrawal delirium tremens, which can in some cases result in strange or aggressive psychotic behavior. Jacob Eisenschmidt was another suspect. This man, known as the Crazy Butcher, was a Swiss butcher with a history of mental illness. He was said to have carried a knife and been violent toward women. Police were looking for a crazy person, as insane crazy, since they didn't think any normal person could commit such atrocities. They were wrong, of course. Serial killers very often look normal. Jack the Ripper might have been a friendly neighbor, a good Samaritan, a father of loving children. When police heard that Eisenschmidt had lost his business and he'd become depressed and aggressive, as well as spending time at an asylum for severe psychiatric disorders, they thought they might have their man. Soon the press was saying the Whitechapel killer was without a doubt the Crazy Butcher. Yet they soon changed their tune. The Crazy Butcher was living inside a straitjacket in an asylum when the next woman was murdered. First, who was Leather Apron? His name was Jack Pizer. Police got hold of him on September 10th. He was 5'4", with a tanned face and a dark mustache. After being taken to Lehman Street Police Station, investigators found 5 long-bladed knives at his house. Even worse, a Hanbury Street resident named Emmanuel Delblast Violinia said he'd seen Pizer threatening to stab a woman on September 8th. Violinia made contradictory statements, so Pizer was released after 36 hours of questioning. Violinia was unreliable, according to Aberline. That was probably true. In 1889, Violinia's plans for emigration to Australia fell through, and months later he was arrested and charged with indecent assault on 3 girls in Oxford. He was subsequently attacked with an iron bar in prison by a prisoner named Charles Atkinson. These were the kinds of people Whitechapel police had as witnesses. Many of them were unreliable. Some ripperologists have said that Violinia only came forward as a witness so he could see the mutilated dead body of the victim. It's known he was a liar, once claiming to have 18 children in his 18 years in London after arriving from Spain. Pizer was Jewish, which seemed to please some of the more xenophobic newspapers, but despite what the media said about him, crazy Jew and half-beast, half-man, there was no evidence he was a killer. He had alibis for the murders. For one, he'd been with relatives. For another, he'd been talking to a policeman as they both watched a massive fire burn at some warehouses that had gone up in flames. While some of the media in England called out those newspapers for their fantastical misinformation, many of the poor believed it, which put Pizer at risk of a mob beating. In the end, Pizer sued some of the papers, while the police had to calm the mad crowds down by publicly stating there was no evidence whatsoever against Mr. Pizer. The residents of Whitechapel were so worried about what was going on in their area that they formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Now people were on the lookout, but Mr. Ripper was about to take things a step further. On September 29th to 30th, the London weather was noted as cloudy with rain, clearing after midnight. A chilly night. Chilly indeed, especially for a woman named Elizabeth Stride, born on November 27, 1843, in Gothenburg, Sweden, with the name Elizabeth Gustafsdotter. In London, her nickname was Long Liz. Her father Gustav was a farmer and her mother Beata was a housewife. It seems Sweden wasn't much better for Liz than London. In 1865, records showed that she was arrested for prostitution in Gothenburg. That year, she gave birth to a stillborn child, and she was treated 2 times at a hospital in Kyrhuset for sexually transmitted diseases. The next year, she moved to London. A man who lodged in the same lodging house later testified that she'd come to London in the service of a foreign gentleman. People who knew her said she would do a good turn for anyone, but it was only a matter of time until London would chew her up and spit her out. 3 years later, she married John Stride. The two seemed to have a decent life living on East India Dock Road in Poplar, East London, after which they started running a coffee shop at Crisp Street. But it seems the coffee shop didn't do too well. Liz had some jobs on the side, but also occasionally prostituted herself. It's reported that during this era, as much as 50% of street vendors doubled as prostitutes. Notably, at some point, she runs into a man named Dr. Thomas Barnardo. He was at her lodging house asking people how they thought children could be saved from the contamination of the common lodging houses and the street. He's one of the people that will later see her dead body and confirm he'd seen her that day. He's also the reason that the children's charity Barnardo's exists today and does great work. The charity probably doesn't like the fact that he's connected to the Ripper murders. More about that later. Disaster struck on September 3rd when John Stride was one of the 600 to 700 people who died when the Princess Alice passenger steamer was hit on the Thames by a huge cargo ship, the SS Bywell Castle. The passengers died horrifically in the water, where 75 million imperial gallons of London's raw sewage had just been dumped. They literally drowned with their heads deep in poop. A writer for the Times newspaper recalled, 2 continuous columns of decomposed fermenting sewage hissing like soda water with baneful gases so black that the water is stained for miles, and discharging a corrupt charnel house odor that'll be remembered by all as being particularly depressing and sickening. Like watching fires, sightseers came from far and wide to watch the cleanup effort and the bodies get fished out of the water. With 5 shillings up for grabs for just one body, fights broke out over the rotting, bloated corpses. The water was so disgusting and toxic that it rotted the clothes off the bodies. 16 people who survived the crash were pulled out, later dying in the hospital. Liz said her 2 children also died in the disaster. Some historians have asked if she made this up in an effort to receive sympathy and compensation, but whatever the case, John and her 2 kids went missing. Liz also said the reason she was missing most of her front teeth was because she was on the sinking boat and was kicked in the mouth when it went down. Still, John may have died of heart disease in 1884. The jury is still out on this matter. It'll always be. What is certain is that in 1885, Liz started living with waterside laborer Michael Kidney, although the relationship was strained due to Liz's heavy drinking. He tried to padlock her in the house, but of course that wasn't going to help with her alcoholism. From 1887 to 1888, she appeared in Thames Magistrate Court for 8 separate cases of drunk and disorderly. She and Michael broke up a few times but were living together at 33 Dorset Street at the time of her demise. He too was a drunk, often staying at the workhouse, and once spending 3 days in prison in July 1888 for being drunk and disorderly and using obscene language. On September 29, 1888 at approximately 6:30 p.m., Liz was seen by Elizabeth Tanner at the Queen's Head pub on Commercial Street. Tanner is the deputy at the lodging house of 32 Flower and Dean Street. She's paid 6 pence to Liz on this day for some cleaning duties. They both drink together and later walk back to the lodging house. Liz is now 44, 5'2", with brown curly hair and light gray eyes. She's pale and missing all of her upper front teeth. That's what Charles Preston sees at the lodging house when she asks to borrow a clothes brush from him. Catherine Lane is also there and at one point is handed a piece of velvet from Liz. Liz tells Catherine she's going out, proudly showing her 6 pence that she's earned. At 11 p.m., the laborer J. Best sees Liz at Bricklayer's Arms on Settle Street. He later says that he was surprised at seeing a woman kissing a man that was respectably dressed. That man is described as 5'5", wearing a small black morning suit and a black bowler hat. He has a thick black mustache. Best jokes with his buddy that the guy must be Leather Apron about to kill another woman. They jokingly shout over to the woman, "That's Leather Apron getting round you." The man and Catherine walk off toward Commercial Road and Burner Street. Best later says he and the woman went off like a shot soon after 11. Sometime between 11 and midnight, fruit seller Matthew Packer in front of his room at 44 Burner Street sells a man and a woman some fruit. The location is 2 doors down from Duftfield's yard. Packer later says the man is aged 30 to 35, medium height, and has dark hair and a dark complexion. He'll later identify the woman as Liz, although he will say a lot of contradictory things to police. At 11:45, laborer William Marshall is outside of his house at 64 Burner Street. He also sees a man and a woman, this time outside house number 63. They look drunk and are kissing. He hears the man say, "You wouldn't say anything but your prayers." The couple then walks off in the direction of Duftfield's yard. William later says the man was well dressed, with a black cutaway coat, dark trousers, and a cap, like a sailor's cap. He says the man was clean-shaven, stout in build and average height. At 12:35 a.m., PC William Smith is walking his beat when he sees a woman with a man wearing a hard felt hat. They're standing opposite the International Working Men's Educational Club, a socialist club whose members are mostly Jewish. Smith will say that the man was about 5'7", with a small dark mustache, wearing a dark cutaway coat. He's carrying a parcel 18 inches long and 6 to 8 inches wide, wrapped with newspaper. The woman, who he'll later confirm is Liz, was wearing a red flower pinned to her jacket. Israel Schwartz says he too saw a woman with a red flower pinned to her, talking with a man who was dressed in a dark jacket, dark trousers, wearing a black cap with a peak. This man, about 30, had dark hair and a dark mustache. He will say the man tried to pull the woman down the street, and then he pushed her into a doorway. The woman screamed, but not loudly. Notably, he says he saw another man across the street smoking a clay pipe. He was tall, about 35, wearing a dark overcoat and a black felt hat. Schwartz will say the 2 men might have been accomplices. The statement kicked off rumors that the Ripper had a partner, and so the crimes were part of a conspiracy of well-dressed men. At 12:45 a.m., a dock worker named James Brown sees a woman he will later say is Liz. She's standing with her back against a wall at the corner of Burner Street, talking to a guy of average size wearing a long black coat. Brown will tell police the woman said, "No, not tonight, some other night." When Brown arrives home at 35 Fairclough Street 15 minutes later, he hears cries of police and murder. A woman named Fanny Mortimer was standing outside of her house on Burner Street. From 12:30 to 1, and she says she saw nobody leave or enter Duftfield Yard, which is right next to her house. Louis Daimschutz, a Russian Jew and cheap jewelry seller, tries to drop his pony off at Duftfield's yard at 1 a.m. The pony is reluctant to go in. Daimschutz later says, "I jumped down at once and struck a match. It was rather windy and I could not get a light sufficient to show that it was a figure of some person, whom by the dress I knew to be a woman." He ran to 40 Berner Street, where the International Workingmen's Educational Club was located. Daimschutz was a steward there. He'll later say that the Ripper might have been in the shadows when he saw the woman and that the Ripper may have run away when he went to the club. On returning to the scene with Isaac Kozabrodsky, a tailor's machinist, the two used a candlelight to see the body. Blood was now evident. Daimschutz said, "The right arm was over the belly, the back of the hand and the wrist had clotted blood on it, the legs were drawn up with the feet close to the wall, the body and the face were warm and the hand cold. The legs were quite warm. The deceased had a silk handkerchief around her neck and it appeared to be slightly torn." At 1:04 to 1:07, PC Henry Lamb and PC Edward Collins arrived at the scene, where there were now about 15 people. Lamb couldn't find a pulse. He then ran off to 100 Commercial Road to find Dr. Blackwell, who sent his assistant Edward Johnston ahead of him. When Dr. Blackwell arrived at 1:16, he said that he thought the victim had been dead for about 20 to 30 minutes, meaning the Ripper might well have been in the shadows when Daimschutz and his pony entered the yard. At 3 p.m. on Monday at St. George's Mortuary, Dr. Blackwell said that the woman was slightly malnourished. He wrote, "There was a clear-cut incision on the neck. It was 6 inches in length and commenced 2.5 inches in a straight line below the angle of the jaw, 3/4 of an inch over an undivided muscle, and then becoming deeper, dividing the sheath." The East London Advertiser wrote on October 13th that police were going to bring bloodhounds to Whitechapel. Critics at the time said it was just for show. One writer said the newspapers openly mocked Sir Charles and his bloodhound theory. "Bloodhounds in Whitechapel," they cried, "is sheer stupidity. And what type of fool is the commissioner?" came the chorus theme. Some of the papers called the victim Lucky Liz because she hadn't been disemboweled like the others. What was strange is no blood was found on her clothing nor on the wall nearby. The theory was that Daimschutz might have scared him away before he had a chance to tear her apart. But it was thought that since she was a middle-aged prostitute and she had her throat cut from left to right like the others, she was definitely a victim of the Ripper. Some newspapers said she was clutching grapes at the time of her murder, but this was not true. Liz was buried in a pauper's grave, number 15,509, on September 30th. If Liz was lucky, the next victim was the very opposite of lucky. Her name was Catherine Eddowes. Born in Wolverhampton on April 14, 1842, Catherine had 3 kids with Thomas Conway, who was living on a pension from the 18th Royal Irish Regiment. One of 12 kids to parents that both died young, Catherine had toughed it out as a teenager in the workhouse. After meeting Conway and moving to London, things got ugly. They had 2 kids together but fought bitterly. Conway hated alcohol and didn't drink at all, but Catherine drank at every opportunity. She was often seen with black eyes, the consequences of disagreements the two had. Still, one superintendent of a lodging house said she was not often drunk and was a very jolly woman, often singing. She left Conway, although his initials TC were forever marked on her left forearm in the form of a crude tattoo. She ended up living with an Irish porter, John Kelly, at 55 Flower in Dean Street, which, as you've seen, was a slum at the center of a lot of crime. Of course, on top of Catherine's day job, sewing for Jewish families on Brick Lane, she sold her body at bargain basement prices. John later says they never quarreled at all. At the time of her death, she was 46, had brown hair and brown eyes, and stood at 5 feet tall. On September 27th, she arrived back in London after going hop-picking in Maidstone, Kent. When she arrived at the lodging house, she told the superintendent that she was going to come into money, saying she would collect the reward for telling the police who the Whitechapel murderer was. She said quite calmly, "I know him." She told him, "I have come back to earn the reward offered for the apprehension of the Whitechapel murderer." 2 days later, September 29th, Catherine and Kelly parted ways for a while. Catherine said she was going to try to get some cash from her daughter, while Kelly pawned his boots as a means to afford lodging for the night. Catherine kept the pawn ticket. That evening, Catherine was seen slumped in the street drunk. PC Louis Frederick Robinson took her to the station to sober her up, whereupon, when asked her name, she drunkenly slurred, "Nothing." The next morning at 12:55 a.m., the 30th, now sober, she said her name was Mary Ann Kelly of 6 Fashion Street. She told PC Hutt that she would now receive a damn fine hiding. He replied, "Serves you right, you've no right to get drunk." At 1:34 a.m., Joseph Lavenda, commercial traveler, and Joseph Chaim Levy, butcher, as well as a furniture dealer named Harry Harris, all left the Imperial Club at 1617 Duke's Place. All three saw a woman and a man talking nearby at Church Passage, which led to a place called Mitre Square. They didn't see the woman's face, but would later recognize the clothes. They described them as black straw bonnet trimmed in green and black velvet with black beads, black strings worn and tied to the head, plus a black jacket with imitation fur on the collar and cuffs. The man was 5'8", about 30, wearing a gray cap with a peak, a red neckerchief, and a pepper and salt colored jacket. He had a mustache. The woman, they said, had her hands on the man's chest. Levy then told his friends he hated walking home alone with characters like this hanging about at night. At 1:40, PC James Harvey walks down Church Passage while on his regular beat. He gets to Mitre Square but doesn't enter. He sees nothing suspicious. At this moment, Dr. Blackwell and company are attending to the dead body of Liz Stride over at Duftfield's yard. The distance between Mitre Square and Duftfield's is about 2,800 feet. So, if walking at 3 miles per hour, the distance is about 10.6 minutes. Jack the Ripper would have had plenty of time to find his next victim and engage in his ad hoc surgery. As has happened with other serial killers, his failure might have angered him so much he took more of a risk with the next victim. At 1:45, PC Edward Watkins enters Mitre Square from the other side, and in the southwest corner he discovers a body, that of Catherine. This dark corner is a well-known place where prostitutes take their clients. When a torch is shown on her body, it is evident her throat was cut. Watkins almost jumps back when he shines the torch on her stomach, where her bowels are protruding. He runs to the other side of the square where he finds night watchman and former cop George James Morris. Watkins stays with the body while Morris goes off and finds PC Harvey, who is still close by. Across the street, they call PC Thomas Holland. Yet again, Whitechapel is swarming with police and drunken nighttime stragglers. Yet there is no sign of a man covered in blood carrying a knife. Detective Constable Daniel Halsey later testifies that he asked for the neighborhood to be searched, and every man stopped and examined. Remember, we're talking about only 1 square mile, though admittedly with lots of dark streets. At 1:55, Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, police surgeon, arrives at the scene. When the doctor checks the body, he finds the pawn ticket. He'll later write, the intestines were drawn out to a large extent and placed over the right shoulder. They were smeared with some feculent matter. A piece of about 2 feet was quite detached from the body and placed between the body and the left arm, apparently by design. The lobe and the auricle on the right ear were cut obliquely through. This was one hell of a sight, a nightmarish thing to behold. When she was found, she'd likely been dead for just half an hour. Strangely, there was no blood on her abdomen or thighs, no blood spurts on the bricks or the pavement, no blood on her clothes. He wrote, there were no traces of recent connection. Her heart wasn't beating when he did the surgery. He'd killed her first. In his second exam, Brown wrote, the face was very much mutilated. The upper eyelid on that side, there was a scratch through the skin of the upper left eyelid, near to the angle of the nose. The right eyelid was cut through about ½ an inch. He said a kidney had been skillfully removed, stating it required a great deal of knowledge to have removed the kidney and to know where it was placed. Still, the police surgeon George Bagster Phillips, who also saw the body, said this didn't mean a professional surgeon had killed the woman. He said a butcher or slaughterman would have been able to do that. Other experts also said this work could have been done by anyone, and that the killer might not have actually been looking for certain organs. It should also be known that at approximately 2:55 a.m., a blood-stained fragment of Catherine's apron was found in a stairway of a tenement building in Whitechapel's Goulston Street. The cop that found it, PC Long, said it also had fecal matter on it. On the wall near this piece of important evidence, someone had written, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," with the spelling mistakes too. It sounds like the words of an illiterate person, either blaming Jews or not blaming Jews. Did not be blamed for nothing mean blamed for something? Had Jack the Ripper dropped the apron off on his escape route? That was the way he likely went. Had he cleaned the knife with the apron and thrown it down? Was the graffiti even anything to do with the bloody apron? It was hard to tell. Cops wiped it off, as it was written in chalk. The police did not want it to get out at the time since so much anti-Semitism was already about. Such a statement could have started riots. There was so much confusion among investigators. How did this killer always slip away so easily? Was he really a skilled surgeon? Police left out much of the mutilations to the press, but they didn't have much choice about suppressing what happened next. On September 27th, London Central News Agency received a letter signed by someone calling themselves Jack the Ripper. This is the now famous Dear Boss letter. The first part went, "Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal." The killer also promised to clip the ears of the next victim and, just for the jolly, send them to the police. This was when the Whitechapel murderer became Jack the Ripper. On October 1st, the same agency received a postcard apparently covered in blood, signed by Saucy Jack, and explaining, "You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow, double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off, had not the time to get ears for police." Had the killer murdered these 2 women and sent the postcard, or had he read about them and right away the very next morning sent the missive? It was hard to know. Police took both the letter and postcard seriously anyway and printed them in newspapers asking anyone who recognized the handwriting to get in touch. Still, some police thought journalists had written the missives themselves since they knew it would get their newspapers a lot of attention. And as for public help, after Dear Boss, police received masses of hoax letters, around 400 further hampering their investigation. Handwriting analysis in the 20th century says the 2 could have been written by the same person, but a journalist, it was later found out, may have written both of them. It was on October 16th when a letter now known as the From Hell letter was sent to George Lusk of Whitechapel Vigilance Committee that made police really believe they had the real deal. It read, "From Hell, Mr. Lusk, Sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate, it was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." It also contained a bit of kidney. Lusk thought medical students might have sent the letter as a hoax. Nonetheless, ripperologists these days say the From Hell letter might well be the real thing. After all, Catherine was missing a kidney. That kidney, according to medical analysis, belonged to a heavy drinker, check, who died within the last 3 weeks, check. 20 years later, Major Henry Smith of the city police said the kidney left in the corpse of Catherine Eddowes was in an advanced stage of Bright's disease, and the kidney in the letter also had the disease. Catherine was buried on October 8th in an unmarked grave. Let's now move on to Jack the Ripper's pièce de résistance, a murder with a different modus operandi, but with the same gory signature, albeit more extreme. If you're wondering what the difference is between modus operandi and signature, the first means the actions necessary to commit the crime, i.e. following poor prostitutes into dark streets. The former is described as a pattern of distinctive behaviors that are characteristic of and satisfy emotional and psychological needs. For example, some craziness like staging the body or taking the organs. It's more about the fantasy than the plan of action. Mary Jane Kelly, aka Black Mary, born in Limerick in 1863 in Ireland, was the daughter of John and Mary. She later became the wife of John Davis, who was killed in a coal pit explosion in Wales shortly after they got hitched in 1879. With a not-so-great start to her young adult life, she soon hit the streets in Cardiff to sell her body. Mary at least was young when she arrived in London, young enough to get herself a client with money who took her to France for a while, hence her other name of Mary Jeanette. Now in 1888, living with Joseph Barnett in a cramped room in Miller's Court on Dorset Road, they at least had the 4 shillings a week to pay for the room. But after Joseph lost his job, it was she who brought home the bacon. The problem was, she also brought home other prostitutes when they didn't have a room for the night, which seems to have made Joseph so mad that he moved out. Mary then lived in fear. She hated being alone in that room, especially because Joseph used to read the newspaper stories about the killer. But at just 25, with long blonde hair and blue eyes, slim and about 5'7", Mary had beauty on her side. She even had a full set of teeth, maybe 2 false teeth, and she was intelligent, according to one friend. She was much superior to that of most persons in her position in life. Mary was quiet most of the time. She was a friendly and bright person, but those that knew her said the demon drink sometimes made her loud and abusive. November 8th, 7:30 to 7:45 p.m., Joseph goes to visit Mary at 25 Dorset Street. It's a cold night and rain has been forecast. They might be separated, but they meet almost daily. Lizzie Albrook later confirms she saw them together. Mary actually spoke to Lizzie, telling her, "Whatever you do, don't you do wrong and turn out as I did." 11:45, Mary Ann Cox, who lives at 5 Miller's Court, sees Mary walking with a man. She's wearing a frock and a red shawl over her shoulders. The man, Cox will later say, was about 35. He was 5'5" or thereabouts, had a carroty mustache, was stout, and wore a bowler hat. The couple stopped at 13 Miller's Court. The man was carrying a quart of beer. Cox notices her friend is, in her own words, very much intoxicated. They say goodnight to each other, after which Mary can be heard singing the words, "A violet plucked from my mother's grave when a boy." The song is about someone's family dying and their bygone happy days. When Cox goes back out into the streets around midnight, Mary is still singing that same song. At 12:30, now the 9th, Catherine Pickett, a flower seller who lives close by, is getting annoyed with Mary's constant singing. The noise carries to the neighbor's house, possibly made worse since Joseph had once broken out the window, and instead of replacing the glass, he and Mary had just put a coat over the hole. Catherine tells her husband she's going to tell the woman to stop her loud singing, at which he replies, "You leave the poor woman alone." At about 1 a.m., Cox leaves her house but notices the light is on in the room where the singing is coming from. That's about the time the prostitute Elizabeth Prater is waiting outside Miller's Court for her partner. She waits about half an hour and then goes to a shop owned by a Mr. McCarthy. She's at the shop for about 10 minutes, and this time she didn't see anyone leave Miller's Court, although she also says she heard no singing. She then goes back to her room, number 20 of 26 Dorset Street. She's very drunk, so she gets undressed and tries to sleep. At 2, a man named George Hutchinson, a casual laborer and a resident of the Victoria Workingmen's Home on Commercial Street, walks past a man at the corner of Thrall Street. But even though it's a strange time to be hanging around, he thinks nothing of it. At Flower and Dean Street, he sees Mary, who asks him for cash. She says, "Mr. Hutchinson, can you lend me 6 pence?" "I can't," he replies. "I spent all my money going down Romford." She then says, "I must go and find some money." She walks in the direction of Thrall Street. She soon meets a man, and according to George, Mary says, "All right," to which the man replies, "You'll be all right for what I've told you?" They laugh, and the man puts his arm over Mary's shoulder. George gets a good look at this man when he sees the couple outside the Queen's Head public house. His skin is pale, his mustache is heavy and dark, he has dark eyes and dark hair, what George will later describe as having a, quote, Jewish appearance. The man is wearing a felt hat pulled down over his eyes. His coat is dark, trimmed in astrakhan. He's wearing a black necktie fixed with a horseshoe pin. He's wearing dark spats, boot covers, over light-buttoned boots. George sees this guy has a massive gold chain in his waistcoat, which has a large seal with a red stone hanging from it. The man is carrying kid gloves in his right hand and a small package in his left hand. He's about 5'6" or 5'7", and maybe about 35, 36 years old. As the couple walks down Dorset Street, George follows until they stop at the passage that leads to Miller's Court. George hears the woman say, "All right, my dear, come along, you'll be comfortable." The man puts his arm over her, at which point she kisses him. She says, "I've lost my handkerchief," and he pulls one out and gives it to her. They go into Miller's Court, and George stays in the street until the clock strikes 3. At 4, Elizabeth Prater is awoken by her cat Diddles walking across her neck. She hears someone scream murder. Her room is right above Mary's, but she can't tell if that's where the scream came from. She later says she didn't do anything, since in the East End it wasn't unusual to hear someone scream murder. From 5:30 to 5:45, this woman goes to the 10 Bells pub for a glass of rum so she can sleep. On returning home, she sleeps until 11 a.m. At 8, Catherine Pickett goes to Mary's room to ask to borrow a shawl. When she knocks on the door, no one answers. Strange, she thinks. Catherine then heads to the market. It's at this very time that a tailor named Maurice Lewis sees who he thinks is Mary leave her room and return quite quickly. Carolyn Maxwell, married to the deputy of the 14 Dorset Street lodging house, sees Mary at the entrance to Miller's Court. She's wearing a dark skirt, black velvet bodice, and a maroon shawl. Carolyn asks Mary why she's up and about so early, and Mary replies the horrors of drink are upon her, literally meaning she's experiencing alcohol withdrawal. Carolyn suggests Mary go up to the Britannia pub and quell her thirst. Mary tells her she just tried to drink some ale but threw it up. Carolyn will be adamant about this meeting with police later, although she will admit she didn't know Mary very well. Carolyn sees Mary about 9 outside the pub with a man wearing dark clothes and a plaid coat. At 10, Maurice Lewis sees Mary in the same pub, drinking with a group of people. At 10:45, John McCarthy, Mary's landlord, sends Thomas Indian Harry Bowyer to Mary's room to get her rent money. Thomas knocks, but there's no answer. He then sees the broken window, so he puts his arm through and moves the jacket and curtains. That's when he sees her. The Times newspaper will later say this murder looked like the work of the devil. Thomas runs off in search of a policeman. He goes to Commercial Street Police Station and tells Inspector Walter Beck and the constables the horrors he's just seen. Beck goes to see for himself, at which point he sends Dr. George Bagster Phillips and sends the telegraph to Scotland Yard asking for assistance. Beck has never seen anything like this. Neither has Phillips, who arrives at Miller's Court at 11:15. Inspector Aberline arrives shortly after. At 1:30, Superintendent Thomas Arnold, head of H Division, after having the door broken through with an axe, sees how much blood there is. It has soaked the bed through, as it has the pillow, after the killer cut Mary's carotid artery in her neck. In the room, a fire is dying down, and the remains of clothes and a bonnet are in it. The spout and the handle of a kettle have burned in the fire. Aberline immediately thinks the killer made this fire for lighting. Dr. Thomas Bond, the well-known police surgeon from A Division, and Dr. Phillips examine the victim. Despite the witness testimonies, these men will say when they found her, stiff with rigor mortis, she'd been dead for many hours. Dr. Bond will say she died at 2 or thereabouts, so the testimonies of the people who saw Mary after that will mostly be ignored. The mutilation this time was almost beyond belief. Here is just some of the incredibly lurid autopsy report written by Dr. Winnie Baxter. The whole of the surface of the abdomen and thighs was removed, and the abdominal cavity emptied of its viscera. The breasts were cut off, the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition of the features. The tissues of the neck were severed all around down to the bone. The viscera were found in various parts, the uterus and the kidneys with one breast under the head, the other breast by the right foot, the liver between the feet, the intestines by the right side, and the spleen by the left side of the body. The flaps removed from the abdomen and thighs were on a table. This was the work of a madman at the height of his depraved escalation. It was the nuclear explosion of obscene murder. Dr. Bond said it wasn't the work of a skilled surgeon or even a butcher, just the work of a very disturbed individual. It was so brutal and so wicked that the public wanted answers. The media reported that one man seemed to think the whole thing was funny. He walked down the street claiming he was the Ripper. He was soon arrested at the corner of Wentworth Street and Commercial Street near the last crime scene. The paper wrote, 2 young men, one a discharged soldier, immediately seized him, and the crowds which always on a Sunday night parade this neighborhood raised a cry of lynch him. Sticks were raised and the man was furiously attacked. On November 9th, Met Police Commissioner Bloodhound fan Charles Warren resigned under pressure. James Monroe, former CID head, would take over on November 27th. Mary was buried on November 19, 1888, with Joseph and a handful of female friends in attendance. Her family did not attend. On her gravestone it was written, "In loving memory of Mary Jeanette Kelly, none but the lonely hearts can know my sadness. Love lives forever." Jack the Ripper is thought to have stopped after this murder, but we also have to ask if he had anything to do with the Thames Torso murders. From 1887 to 1889, police found 5 dismembered bodies of women. Only one was ever identified. Sometimes parts of the body were found, but not the head. The Times said this about one of the murders: "The division of the parts showed skill and design, not, however, the anatomical skill of a surgeon, but the practical knowledge of a butcher or a knacker." In one case, a woman's torso was found on Tuesday, September 10, 1889, under a railway arch in the Whitechapel area. She'd been beaten, which wasn't Jack the Ripper's style, but her abdomen had been cut open, which was. Had the Ripper not stopped? Between 1857 and 1890, there were rarely more than 400 murders a year in London, and during the 1890s, the rate was usually below 350 a year. That's still more than the present day, with London from 2018 to 2023 seeing anywhere from 118 to 144 homicides a year. So there were more murders than the canonical 5. They may or may not have been related, but police then and still today say only 5 really had Jack the Ripper's footprints on them. Still, even the last one, which this time was of a younger woman, not outside but in her home, and with total overkill, may have been a different person. Some have blamed her partner, Mr. Barnett. Barnett had identified his former partner by her eyes and ears, since there wasn't much of her face left. But was it him? An envelope possibly belonging to him was found at the murder scene of Annie Chapman. It showed the letter M.S.P. and the number 2, and his address was Miller's Court, Spitalfields, 26 Dorset Street. There is speculation that it was he who Catherine Eddowes was about to out, but that's all it is, speculation. He was of Irish origin, and the From Hell letter contained what looked like some Irish dialect. He looked like the Ripper and lived in the area, but maybe the cops left him alone because he wasn't certifiably insane. As we know in today's world, the Ripper wouldn't have acted crazy. Barnett actually fits the profile the FBI came up with many years later. Also, the door was locked when cops arrived at the murder scene, meaning the killer might have had a key. Aberline questioned Barnett for 4 hours. Already idle rumors said he'd killed her out of jealousy or as an evil way to tell her that she shouldn't prostitute herself. Aberline said nonsense. Barnett was innocent, he said. Police interviewed over 2,000 people, investigating 300 of them and detaining 80 of them. At the end of that, they said they still had no idea who the killer was. Aberline had his theories, although he once said, "We're lost in theories." There were so many of them. Aberline had one suspect he particularly liked, George Chapman, a Polish-born killer of 3 women in London. Born Seweryn Klosowski, later studying practical surgery at the Warsaw Praga Hospital, Chapman beat his mistresses, poor women, and killed 3 with poison. And oh boy, did he fit the description of a dark-haired man in dark suits with a dark mustache. Still, the Ripper killed strangers, not lovers. He mutilated, not poisoned. Chapman was a violent misogynist, though, and a killer whose wife later said would often go out for many hours at a time. He lived in George Yard and for a time on Whitechapel Road. He was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on the 7th of April 1903, the same year Aberline started saying that he was the Ripper. Robert Milne, who was for a time the Metropolitan Police Directorate of Forensic Services, wrote in a paper that he presented at the International Association for Identification Conference in 2011 that Chapman, like Aberline had suspected, was Jack the Ripper. We won't go into detail for all the many suspects, but here's a rundown. Was it the Oxford-educated Montague John Druitt? His own family thought it was. This upper-middle-class man drowned in the Thames not long after the last murder. He was possibly depressed and unhappy at having to hide his homosexuality. But why is he accused? It's partly because of Assistant Chief Constable Sir Melville Macnaghten, who called Druitt sexually insane. Remember, this was a time of rife homophobia. The evidence against him was circumstantial, and even today, Druitt doesn't seem like a suitable suspect for many Ripperologists. In his famous memorandum, Macnaghten also mentioned Michael Ostrog, a Russian conman. Macnaghten also wrote, "Unquestionably a homicidal maniac." He wasn't, and no serious investigator today thinks Ostrog was the Ripper. But Macnaghten's third choice, Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew and a hairdresser who ended up in the asylum after threatening his sister with a knife, was a better suspect. Well, it certainly seemed that way in 2019, when a paper published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences said it had proved through DNA taken from Catherine Eddowes' shawl that Kosminski was the Ripper. Still, some scientists have refuted the findings. There's more evidence supporting this theory, which is why Russell Edwards, author of Naming Jack the Ripper, said he is absolutely sure Kosminski was the Ripper. One of the world's most famous crime writers, Patricia Cornwell, said she was sure who the Ripper was too. For her, it was renowned artist Walter Sickert. This impressionist certainly made an impression on Cornwell. She said his mitochondrial DNA matched that from one of the 600 Ripper letters sent to Scotland Yard back in the day, and she said after studying the man and his obsession with Jack the Ripper, she was sure it was him. Still, other crime writers have said she is well off the mark, and as police are sometimes prone to do, she led her own investigation with tunnel vision. There's the Liverpool cotton merchant James Maybrick, whose diary the scrap merchant Michael Barnett made public in 1992. Maybrick had lived in London at the time of the murders. The diary entries describe the murders in Whitechapel ending with, "I give my name that all know of me, so history do tell, what love can do to a gentleman born. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Still, that all sounds a bit too convenient, and Barrett had admitted in the past he created the diary, although he later retracted that. Also, the journals show inaccuracies with the murders that have been commonly made, as if someone was making the entries after reading what's on the internet. That's why the general consensus is that the diary was forged. Then there's the pocket watch, which, like the diary, has been tested by scientists for its authenticity. The watch, found in 1993, was made in Leeds in 1847 or 1848. This is true. It also is true that the inscription says J. Maybrick along with I am Jack, as well as showing the initials of the 5 canonical Ripper victims. Nonetheless, a smart person with time and money could have faked those inscriptions. Scientists can't be sure. It's just too hard to tell, even when you have an electron microscope. In terms of proving beyond any reasonable doubt, there is no jury in the entire world who would find any of the suspects put forward by so-called experts guilty. Some of the theories are just outlandish, but suit a certain fantasy, such as rich men killing poor people, since evil aristocrats make for compelling stories. Was the Ripper Prince Albert Victor, as some have said? The prince wasn't even in London for most of the murders. As for John Bernardo, the wealthy philanthropist we mentioned who founded the charity for deprived children, he also makes a good tale, but there's no real evidence for him being the killer. The American Francis Tumblety is another suspect, a man once arrested for involvement in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, an unashamed misogynist and hater of prostitutes who was staying at a boarding house in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. He used to keep women's wombs in jars and show them off to friends, people who knew him as the doctor who had potions that could cure everything. Yes, he was a snake oil quack, something of an American psycho who had brushes with the law in the UK and the US. One of his friends later said, "Knowing him as I do, I should not be the least surprised if he turned out to be Jack the Ripper." He was a scammer, possibly with psychopathic tendencies, and the Whitechapel police were looking at him as a Ripper suspect, although they might or might not have tried to have him extradited. It seems not, and anyway, the New York City police, who admitted to having him under surveillance, said there is no proof of his complicity in the Whitechapel murders, and the crime for which he is under bond in London is not extraditable. His crime in London was gross indecency, having sexual relations with another man, which was illegal. As for being the Ripper, was he too tall at 5 feet 10? Would witnesses not have said something about this outlandishly big mustache? He was dodgy, but not that dodgy. The fact of the matter is, there are no solid cases against any suspects. Maybe the Ripper crimes were not committed by one man, but a few men. Regardless, we hope we've shown you today that another interesting part of the story was the state of Victorian London for the poor. Now that was criminal. Now you need to watch how they caught Ted Bundy day by day, or have a look at how these sneaky serial killers finally got caught.